our final session before we go into the evening, and this is not Kwame Dawes. Do you know who this man is? This is Simon Armitage, the Poet Laureate, instead. Kwame may or may not join us from Washington, but he very well probably won't, because we can't find him. And that's the first technical hitch we've had in a hybrid festival, and I think that's pretty good going so far. But the good bit about technology was that I picked up my mobile phone and rang Simon straight away and said, I don't care whether you're in your underpants, could you come over? And he put his trousers back on again and ran.
Where's this going, Jude?
Anyway, we're just going to spend the time that Kwame and I would have spent. And the conversation that Kwame and I were going to have, but we'll have it instead, was really about where we, as artistic practitioners, are, where are we trying to get to? What informs the decisions that we're making about living in the world that we live in now and making art at the same time? What does that look like for both of us? And we've known each other, I think, maybe 30 years probably. And I've done a number of projects together. And I think I can always rely on you for two things at the same time, and I'll just see whether they would correspond with what you think. I can always rely on you to believe that the imagination needs to sort of to form itself for you and the people that you're working with around an artistic project, something that is driven by artistic principles, that it always has got to be good art. And I can always rely on you as well to be looking at it from the point of view of people who wouldn't normally find a quick way in to art. It's not a given that they'll get it ever in their life. It's not a given that they are expected to be part of it. In fact, they've often been excluded. So I always feel as if you're carrying those two things side by side, a real commitment to art. And then a part of the definition of that is that it has to have an opening space, if not several entrance points, where it doesn't normally naturally have them. Is that fair? Good?
It is fair, yeah. Actually, I think you can rely on me for three things. Those two, and also, if I'm lying semi-naked in a hotel bedroom, you can call me, and 5 minutes later I'll be on stage.
That is the third thing, actually.
Yeah,
okay, well, what I thought he was going to say, and he would have been right, is you can rely on him for a laugh.
Yeah.
Right? There's that thing of where does humour lie in all of this? Very, very important too.
So just to say something in relation to those 2 points, I think if I think back, when I started within a life of art, I didn't know that's what I was doing. I was a daydreamer. I was very introspective. I wanted a different kind of internal life to what was going on outside. And I think when I started writing, making poems, making images, there was something quite selfish about it, about not wanting to be part of the mainstream and to somehow indulge a part of me, a part of my life that I didn't properly understand. And I think it's only in the second half of my life as a writer that I've come to understand more about communities of artists and belonging to a sort of citizenship of artists and sharing and feeling obligations towards other writers, for example. As a teacher, I think that's true of most poets. There comes a point where you feel as if you want to give something back. And, I've of late become involved in lots of projects. This one, for example, that have probably come about through being laureate, where I've started to think back about the life that I had as, in my adolescence and wanting to write and so on and so forth, and how I actually got those opportunities. And those opportunities came because other people were extending them towards me. They were saying, this is happening over here, why don't you come and be part of it? Somebody asked me a few years ago to write a little paragraph for a book that we were putting together, and to identify the person who, you know, I wanted to say thank you to for, you know, giving me the opportunity to become a writer. And there were several people that I could have picked. And in the end, I wrote a paragraph about our local authority because it struck me that every chance and opportunity I'd got back then was created by a benevolent local authority who put money into workshops, writing groups, small publishers, magazines, readings, so on and so forth. Opportunities that are hard to come by now. And I think to some extent I've recognised that process and how I've moved from just wanting to create something of my own for myself to being a very proud member of a global artistic community that can both, you know, give presentations and offer things back to other people. But I was also going to say, Jude, that I have a strong recollection of when we started talking about projects and meeting you the first time. So we had a meeting at West Yorkshire Playhouse where I was talking about doing a version of a classical play. I can't remember which one it was. And I wasn't really sure what Jude's view of the world was. But there was this moment where we were sort of sat there looking at this play, and she said, "Are you thinking of doing it this particular way?" And I just thought, I'm just going to have to take a chance here. And I said, "No." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "I think that would be boring." And Jude said, "Brilliant." And actually, it was a breakthrough moment for me because I suddenly thought, this is somebody who's interested in classical literature, but is also interested in entertainment and drawing people in and saying to people, you know, these ancient books, which are sometimes seen as the preserve of scholars, are actually for everybody. They belong to everybody.
Now, we haven't Kwame.
Okay, great. I'll go back to the room. Get on with whatever I was doing.
Don't go away. Don't go away. Kwame, are you there? Do I have to do anything? Kwame, can you hear us? The host would like you to unmute. I will. Kwame.
Hey.
Hey. We're very pleased that you're there. And actually, Simon Armitage is here as well.
Hi, Simon.
Hey, Kwame. Hi.
And there's a lovely audience. And we've just started the conversation, really, which you and I began last night, about, I suppose, the kind of artists that you find you are is really what we're sort of talking about. Simon said that he began making work. Well, you use the word selfish, but I'm not sure whether selfish is the... Well, wouldn't describe it, but basically to self-fulfill your dreams, to explore your interior life, to have a chance to do all of that. And that only later, when he was invited into other spaces to make work with people, for people, by people, about people, did the work kind of expand out into, I suppose, what you might call work that has social intention, work that can be of use, the work that you've done films like in the young offenders units and with the forces and so on. And I was actually reflecting on almost the opposite thing for me, because I'm a theatre director, and from when I was a little girl, I was always making stories and insisting that other people were in them, because it was the only way I could make the stories if they agreed to be my actors. And I was doing this when I was about 6. And so I always knew that it was important for me to have lots of different stories available in order to kind of have a repertoire. And I think, you know, very early on, because storytelling, because I'm not a writer, because I'm basically, like lots of theatre people, it comes from a sort of social connection. You know, you're doing it with lots of other people, and you need them there with you. I kind of quickly realized that the stories that I was watching in drama were nothing to do with me, mainly as a girl, you know. And I couldn't be a hero because I wasn't a man. And I wasn't from the south of England, so I wasn't, you know, my family weren't sort of middle class even. So I had no option really but to think, well, what are the stories I want to make up? And so I almost became an artist activist, maybe for the same reasons as you almost, which is that my inner life wasn't being reflected in the stories that I could watch in drama. So I had to make them up myself. But because I was making them up with other actors, and then I had to go and find an audience for them. Otherwise, you can't have, you know, you're not going to put them in a book, so you've got to go and find an audience. And naturally, the audience who might want to watch the stories I was going to make up were other people a bit like me. So you end up being in this activist theatre space because you're really just trying to tell the stories that excite you. And then other people come and say, would you tell my story as well? And you think, oh, that's interesting. That's not my story. Like, you know, very early on, I did a whole three-part series about travellers or, you know, people who live in high-rise flats or whatever. And so I don't think I ever went through a patch until later, about 10 years after being a director, of doing so much improvisational work in communities, work around social spaces. I suddenly thought, I don't know whether I've ever had the nourishment of poetic work. You know, I went and started directing Shakespeare and directing Chekhov and directing, if you like, classical work much later in my career, partly as a method of having some nutrition back, which might sound a funny thing to say, but one of the hard things about making work all the time is A, it's all brand new, you know, and I'm not a writer, so a lot of it was sort of made through improvisation. But also, you know, there is something wonderful, whether you're directing Singing in the Rain, or King Lear, or The Seagull. You know, even though they're all written by white men, there is something wonderful about being able to sort of sit inside a beautifully constructed piece. Just as it's wonderful to sit inside a Seamus Heaney piece of poetry, or a Simon Armitage piece of poetry, or a Kwame Dawes piece of poetry, where you are nourished by the joy of the greatness of the work, and it's become a sort of sorrow for me as a female artist that there's been so few historical opportunities for women to make work, and then the work that they made was so unavailable and not visible, that I feel that I didn't have the possibility to sit inside my own tribe and love my own tribe's work and get nourished by my own tribe's work. And that's something which, you know, I realized later in my life. And the reason I created the Wow Women in the World festivals was to say, well, I think that girls and women deserve this work. They deserve a history of art, but we haven't got it, or we have to go back and find it. And of course, you know, if you're black, you can look at work that has also been made invisible or denied and feel the same lack of nourishment. But I think it's very vivid anyway if you're a woman, that. Because even the great kingdoms of the great empires always had artists, but they weren't women unless they were in disguise. So, and interestingly, it sort of forced me to remain, I think, in the hinterland of art making, because I still find now, even though I directed lots and lots of work and, you know, quite well and won awards and things, I now feel hesitant to go and direct that work again, because I feel as if it sort of takes me off mission. So that's kind of partly why I make festivals, because I'm wanting to encourage artistic practice that notices who's not in the room and whose stories haven't been told yet, and provides the excitement and the commitment that we will tell those stories, we will make that space available, we will do that work. So that's interesting that, you know, even though you, Simon, have made new tracks, I think you've really changed the geography for others about paths they could walk down that weren't there before. You've helped, you've made new paths. And because you're from Yorkshire, I often think of you actually making new dry stone walls as well as little paths. And you similarly, Kwame, you've sort of allowed other people to walk behind you. I don't feel I've done that yet as a kind of female artist, if you see what I mean. But I think I might have done it as a provider of space in which art can be made. So that's what I've been thinking about recently.
I would. I think there are a couple of things that what you're saying resonates with me. First of all, I suspect that you're wrong about whether you opened a path as a female artist and sort of created that space. And why I say that is, my entry into writing, I started in theater. But it really is in a context in which there's a format for the 30 or 40 years before I sort of thought about being a writer. There was a format of breaking silences, of creating something, as Kamal Brathwaite said, torn and new. And what I'm speaking of there is the emergence of writers from Africa and from the Caribbean in that period between 1930, 1940, 1950, the emergence of this new literature, this new expression of literature that said, we are writing about a new space, we are entering into the world by telling these stories that have not had the opportunity to be told. And that space, that energy was certainly there when I was growing up in the 70s and in the 80s as a kind of the beginnings of a tradition. And there were essays and articles, Wilson Harris writing about West Indian tradition and the West Indian novel. The idea of tradition sort of provoked by Eliot and Eliot articulating tradition as a kind of reach back to a sense of belonging and origin. And even if it's an origin that is of a resistance to the old tradition and sort of finding a new tradition. And the absolute comfort and ease with which writers who were our colonizers felt absolutely comfortable saying, I'm writing into a tradition. It's fine, I can write. And therefore, be preoccupied with my self-expression and all of these kinds of things. So the space I grew up in was to read Walcott and say, my goodness, what can I do to keep this going? What can I do to speak for my street that hasn't been written, to speak for my island that hasn't been written, to speak for my moment that hasn't been written and hasn't yet been written, and that there's a tremendous excitement about coming into that space and then being challenged by that space. So of course we read everybody. We read the British writers and the American writers and so on, but then we said, and I certainly said, where do I fit into this conversation? Now, I know Simon had that conversation himself, clearly, because in his early work, you can see this challenge of saying, what do you do in this space, whether it's a class distinction or a regional distinction? But we all ask that question. But I would say that for me, the presumption that I was writing into this space as building a tradition changed the conversation from self-expression to responsibility and necessity, to the responsibility to the tradition. And there are two traditions then that are operating in that conversation. And for me, at one stage, it was theater, understanding what is theater. So I'd been reading the Grotowskis and the Peter Brooks and all of these people and saying, what do they mean to me? What does that mean to me? But what is the poetic aesthetic that is going to drive this Caribbean thing? And I'm reading, Lovelace or Walcott or Errol Hill talking about the calypso aesthetic and that poetic and how that's going to affect it all. And me saying, I grew up in reggae. So what is this reggae aesthetic that is going to shape my work? But you can see what my preoccupations were at 18. I was not thinking about how to self-express. I was thinking of how do I belong as a Black Caribbean writer to this world? How do I sit beside Wole Soyinka? How do I sit beside Athol Fugar? How do I sit beside all of these people, and what is the distinct tradition that fixes me and that makes me work. Now, this seems like heavy stuff, but it's damn exciting because what it's doing is it's giving you this raison d'être. It's giving you something even outside of yourself that says, I may be leaving something. I may be leaving something that will set another set of trends going. And the distinction I would make is that I learned really quickly that if I am alone in my army, it's going nowhere. I can't be part of a tradition that's one dude shining brightly in the world, because that is just doomed to failure. There has to be an army. There has to be a team that is rushing through and saying in so many different various voices this great noise. And if there's anything that has driven me to be both a writer and to be somebody who facilitates writing and the expression of writing, and from the tribe, I love that idea of the tribe, from my tribe, it is that sense that I become better by being surrounded by multiple voices. And only then do I have the luxury of self-expression. It's only at that point that do I have that luxury, because if there's no framework for it, then what's the point?
Simon, where do you sit in that story?
So many ideas spinning around for me there. I do recognize on occasions that one of the reasons I wanted to write is that I want to be on my own sometimes. And I don't know whether that's helpful or unhelpful to this conversation, but I've always realized that in the way that I make things, it's got to be an individual act, and that it necessitates being on your own. And I do quite like being on my own. I go through long periods of time where I don't like people very much, and I think maybe the writing is a way of trying to get over that or confronting it. But I'm also aware at the same time that as I'm writing, I'm thinking about an audience. I'm thinking about joining with people through the eventual presentation of the work. So even though it's just me and the point of contact is one small point of a pen against a piece of paper, I think there is something quite choral going on at that moment, and that is to do with what Kwame describes as tribal. I'm thinking about my people, who they are, who I want to show off to, who I want to impress, whose validation I want, and so on and so forth. I was also thinking about, the tradition, and it's a very slippery thing, because most of the people who I idolize as writers have become members of that tradition through being oppositional. So if you think, it's easy to think of Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley, and the Romantics as being these great sort of keystones in the tradition. They were massive radicals. They were radical writers. At that time in literary history, they were sympathetic writers. They were sympathetic to people who existed on the margins, who were left behind by society. Lyrical ballads, was an attempt to, it was like pressing the reset button on literature. It was an attempt to, represent literature to regular people. And I think that's easy to forget. Eliot, we don't think of him as a radical, but actually, he was working against what had become the tradition of lyric, metered poetry. And Shakespeare was making work at a time when the theatres were being closed down. It was difficult to be those people sometimes in their age. And a lot of the people I admire who've now been sort of canonized and are part of this tradition, during their moment were radical thinkers and radical writers. There's got one other thought floating through my mind, which was that I was a probation officer up until the mid-90s, and gave that up to be a poet. Wasn't it a hard choice, I have to say. But I sometimes, it occurs to me, and you know, you mentioned Feltham Sings, you know, a work that I made in a young offender institution, various other projects that I've been involved with. I didn't know it at the time, but in retrospect, I wonder whether I've been carrying on some of that social work as a writer. I didn't mean to. It wasn't my ambition, but I can see as well from a lot of the theatre pieces that I've written, which are all about people who've had their voices taken away, and I've tried to provide those voices. Whether I've, you know, it's continued to be a work of social engagement, really, even though I do it on my own in a room.
Well, I always think of you in that way. Like I said to you earlier, Kwame, when I was introducing Simon, Simon and I have known each other a long, long time, and you have such an instinctive flare-up, you know, if you feel that social injustice is happening, or complacency, or arrogance. I mean, you know, you get cross, and I say that as a compliment, because you just don't like it. And so I don't think your work is separated from this idea of still trying to make... I mean, I'm not saying that you can't just get involved in a blackbird and their progress, but I think that, you know, journey towards social progress is still writ very deep in you, in my opinion. But I think that, you know, one of the things that perhaps less so now, but the artist kind of milieu, the establishment, you know, there's a particular group of people here, Kwame, you're not here so you can't see them, but they're, you know, they wouldn't be here on a Saturday afternoon for a human rights festival unless they were, broadly speaking, wanting the world to be better. But I could equally well be at I'll just caricature for a second, but I could be at a festival of classical music, and I can guarantee you that most of the people in the audience would not be thinking that this is how they'd like to spend their weekend, i.e. thinking about human rights, because a lot of those people not only feel that they have all the rights they need, but aren't necessarily particularly interested in anybody else having any. You know, if they get them, then maybe fine, but they're not going to do anything about it, and aren't interested, in fact quite hostile to the idea that art should play a role in social change. I mean, they all like Fidelio. They like that moment when Beethoven has written that the prisoner comes out into the light and all go, oh. But they wouldn't want it to be happening now. And so I always feel as if, you know, you have to accept the fact that if you think about art and social justice, that you're already an outsider. Now, some of us are outsiders, you know, because we're black or disabled or gay or a woman or northern. I mean, you know, you're an outsider to a certain extent from that establishment. And I'm interested as we make our way inside and become the establishment. I mean, you're the Poet Laureate, for goodness sake. Then whether, you know, I think part of the Black Lives Matter thing with the arts was to say, well, you think you're part of the solution, you're actually part of the problem as well. So I think, you know, one of the things that's also interesting to me is even if I have classified myself as an outsider, I'm still a cis white gendered woman. So, you know, plenty of insideness there. And how do you as an artist navigate both making social progress and also stepping out of the way? I don't know. I mean, I think that you have to be in this constant search is what I'm saying. Because I notice people who are not on a search, they're never going to be on a search, and they don't care. And then there's those people who go, well, I'm part of the other brigade. But it puts a lot of onus on us to be thinking all the time about all of these other stories.
Do you think, and it's a question for you as well, Kwame, that being involved in the arts somehow keeps the door of your heart open? I've sometimes felt that it's continued to make me vulnerable towards feeling empathy and sympathy for other people. I remember the other thing I was going to say about meeting you, Jude, for the first time, was hearing you say that one of the things that art does is to promote a sense of yourself and a sense of empathy. Yeah, it allowed you to feel sorry for other people because you understood yourself better. And I think I've always carried that idea in me, that just being a practitioner in the arts makes you sort of vulnerable and ready to recognize other people's suffering at some level.
Do you think that's true, Kwame?
I have a very okay. So I actually think that that we are who we are as people. Like I am a political person because of the circumstances of my life. I think and I feel, and so whether I was a writer or not, I'll be doing something. Like so the question I always end up with is, and I actually do not expect all writers to be that way, because they're jerks who are right. I mean, all kinds of people are writers. Really, I don't have any illusions that writers have some sort of special function and role, and so I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it. And some writers, I am an editor. I'm somebody who likes to collect work and to encourage people to write. I mentor and so on. I don't expect all writers to do that. In fact, I don't. It's not their job. Their job is to write. If they have another drive and inclination, it is it. But I will look at you in the face and say, this is a dumb kind of attitude to have about race. I don't care whether you're a writer or you're a garbage person or you're a singer or whatever. You as a human being. Now, the reason I make that distinction is because I think as a writer, it has always been my sense that how can I be true to this body and with all its stuff, which it includes its ideology, its ideas of beauty, its desires and so on. How can I be true to this body in language? And that act is the act that then, therefore, if I sound political in my poetry, it's not because I'm writing political poetry, but I'm writing Kwame Dawes. And that's who it comes out of. And therefore, I trust that, which gives me the chance to really disagree and disabuse the notion, good old Roland Barthes' declaration of the death of the author, which is a very convenient arrangement, if you ask me, because we just have to look at the text and not the person. I'm not into that. I will ask the person who generated the text, what the hell are you talking about? What in this poem? And don't tell me it's just a piece of art. I'm saying it's coming from something. And as I have to challenge myself as I make art, I must challenge. So it's the person that emerges. But yet, one of the mantras, I was 20 when I said, my aesthetic idea is going to be this idea of empathy. Because empathy is a function of the imagination. Empathy doesn't work without imagination. In fact, empathy is essentially imagination. It is to imagine how somebody else feels. It's to make that leap. That's why art and empathy are so inextricably connected, and it's an ethical truth. We exercise our capacity for empathy by engaging in art. Whether we read it, we listen to it, we see it, what we do, that is something, it's muscle in our bodies that allows us to feel as. The entire movement, civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, for better or for worse, was predicated on the notion that what Langston Hughes says is that besides they will see how beautiful we are and they will be ashamed. It is that moment of empathetic connection that makes people go, maybe I'm wrong to see this person as this. And that's what it's predicated on. We can question it and should question it all the way through. But I think the failure to imagine as another is feeling, it is the moral and ethical failure. That's racism, that's sexism, because we block that capacity. And art, I believe, helps us to exercise that capacity. But our structure, the idea of a radical in this space, but listen, we can be very real about it in the context of say, poetry, for instance, in Britain. And who becomes canonized, and how is that decided? What is it? Is it the London Review of Books? Is it Faber? Who is it that canonizes? Because people are eliminated because of that structure. Now that to me seems to be a different kind of discussion. It has nothing to do with the artist. It has nothing to do with what the artist is making. It has to do with what the social structures that we create in the society are doing to destroy people. And so, for me, that becomes a different discussion. The artist, I think, should be conscious of those lines that are created. The artist should be like Gwendolyn Brooks says, I'm no longer going to be published by this major publisher. I'm going to go to this black press. Why is she doing that? This is not because she wants to be with her tribe, but because she knows that by pulling herself away, it allows her to support something that is going to make the other artists work. Those to me are political choices that artists make, which have to do with who they are in their gut. It doesn't have to do with their art. The art will take care of itself, but who are you as a person? I'm very interested in that kind of question. And at the same time, I enjoy the art. I enjoy the art. I enjoy jerk artists. I enjoy it, but it doesn't mean that I do not recognize that in them, there are these problems. And it's a constant dilemma, yeah.
Okay.
My kids, by the way, remind me of that. I can be a beautiful, everybody, oh, Kwame's so amazing. So my kids say, Dad, that was just a jerky. You know, we don't appreciate that. And all of a sudden I realized I could be cute as an artist all I want to be, but who am I?
Yes, no, my children do that to me as well. So I think that we're going to close that at that point because there's no ending to the conversation. There's no conclusion to be reached. It's just wonderful to be with people thinking together. And, part of the whole reason for doing the festival, from my point of view, is that we can't get to human rights without empathy. And so the work of artists in this space, I think, in terms of social progress, is absolutely critical. Thank you, Kwame, for joining us. And thanks, Simon, for running over from the hotel. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye. Bye.